The conflict between the United States and Japan started with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The question we kept in mind while researching the subject and built this presentation around was, how did World War II affect Japanese Americans living in the U.S.?
World War II affected many people. There were others involved other than the Japanese. People like the Jewish in Germany were also interned. These Japanese Americans are one of the most mentioned of all the interned people during this time period.
On September 1st, 1939, World War II began. Then on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. This evoked President Roosevelt into signing Executive Order 9066, which in turn caused any person that was decided to have Japanese heritage to be relocated.
Executive Order 9066 was signed on February 19, 1942, by President Franklin Roosevelt. This document instructed all people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of America to go to internment camps. Executive Order 9066 was taken into action quickly when the American government was caught in paranoia and hysteria after the Pearl Harbor bombing.
Japan bombed Pearl Harbor for two reasons. First of all, destroying powerful naval vessels removed a main threat from the Pacific, leaving them free to take over China's import market and gain control of the Dutch East Indies. The U.S. had no choice but to retaliate. They entered the war. The current president at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, then signed Executive Order 9066, which stated that all citizens deemed to have Japanese heritage would be relocated to one of 10 internment camps placed throughout the U.S.
This is a large conflict because while the Japanese were possibly a threat and were certainly seen as one, a large number of the internees were in fact American citizens who were being denied constitutional rights by their own government.
About 110,000 to 120,000 people of Japanese heritage were sent to internment camps during World War II. While interned, the citizens who were relocated were denied the civil rights that are granted to every U.S. citizen as described in the Bill of Rights. For none of them were interned because of committing a crime. Being interned had other disadvantages, even after internment. Internees went to makeshift schools taught by fellow internees who didn't even know how to teach while in internment, and therefore would not be able to easily get a job with as high as pay compared to other United States citizens.
The president had his reasons for relocating the Japanese. The United States was chaos after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The main threat in the eyes of the general public was the Japanese, and he was removing them from the public eye. He hit two birds with one stone and both protected himself from criticism and the Japanese people from persecution. Another threat to the U.S. was Germany, but there were too many German Americans to relocate them all.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor scared the citizens of the U.S. Keeping the race responsible for the bombing of Pearl Harbor in one place gave the Americans a feeling of security. With the stress of the war, the bombing really didn't help them at all. The Japanese Americans had been discriminated against even before the internment. The bombs just made things worse. The president had to calm down the citizens by doing something about the ongoing war around them.
This was another conflict, as many Japanese people were injured or killed in riots that turned against them.
Part of the hate was fueled by propaganda. The U.S. and also the Japanese both had and used a lot of propaganda. The propaganda depicted the Japanese as monsters and was quickly accepted and believed. The propaganda was used to get the civilians behind the war and support the troops. These are some of the posters from the war. Some depictions for the Japanese people were rats and monkeys, and they were often referred to as Japs, which is a racist name for Japanese people.
Relocation camps were run by the War Relocation Authority, or WRA, which was run by two men named Milton Eisenhower and Dillon S. Meyer. There were 10 camps in total. These camps were called Grenada, Colorado, Gila River, Arizona, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Jerome, Arkansas, Manzanar, California, Poston, Arizona, Minidoka, Idaho, Rower, Arkansas, Topaz, Utah, and Tule Lake, Montana. There were also several places where internees who were on their way to camp stayed.
The camp conditions were just like those of any other internment camp at the time. They were guarded, and while photos released to the public at the time didn't show it, they were surrounded by barbed wire fences and armed guards. They lived in tar paper huts and used communal areas for everything from showering to eating. Many of the people who remember the camps think of the lines. They were a part of every task: eating, washing, shaving, and even using the facilities.
Tule Lake was in fact a segregation camp where the internees that protested their internment were kept. They were labeled as disloyals and were used to farm the farmland around the camp. This camp had 28 towers surrounding it and 8 tanks. It also had an extraordinarily large number of machine guns, considering there was a war going on. In other camps, several people actually died because they approached the fence and were shot.
Another injustice or conflict between the internees and the government were the camp conditions. Even prisoners now have better environments than these thousands of people did. For instance, the Japanese Americans had to temporarily sleep in abandoned horse stalls, while prisoners get their own bed and room that is inside and warm.
When the war was over, tensions were still high. The Japanese Americans that had been interned had lost many things during their time. They were gone, including their homes. Crooked people often stole their property by taking possession of it. Some people returned to their homes expecting to get back to normal life and found themselves under arrest for trespassing. On top of that, they weren't able to become U.S. citizens for 6 years after they were released from internment camps in 1946.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act to repay over 100,000 interned Japanese Americans. They were given a formal apology and $20,000 each. These reparations were given in order of age, with the oldest people at 107 receiving them first, and the youngest people receiving them last.
The conflict between the United States and Japan has been resolved, but it was definitely a compromise. For all those people who were interned may have never been able to rebuild their lives, and many didn't even have lives to rebuild. Though it may not have been enough for most, it was all that was manageable to acquire congressional approval. While the money helped, the apology must have felt good to read and know that the government was finally apologizing to them.
Though the Japanese people were happy to receive the money and apology, they felt it wasn't worth the pain they were put through in the camps. After they were released, it took 6 years before they could become a U.S. citizen again. We should hope this never happens again in the future, but if it does, we can learn from this and stand up for equal rights between all creeds, religions, and races.
Before this is over, we would like to give special thanks to the people who made this presentation possible. First, to Miss Dowdy, our teacher. Without her, we wouldn't know about NHD or what we needed in the documentary, and our project would be a mess. Secondly, we would like to thank Mr. Nesbitt, our science teacher, for taking away from his own teaching time and giving us a lot of time to work on our presentation and burning our presentation onto a DVD. We would also like to thank Isaac's great Uncle Cho. He was an amazing primary source when researching the camp conditions. He wrote a book that was very useful when looking at how individuals were treated before and after the war. Lastly, we'd like to give thanks to our parents who took the time to drive us to school and this competition and supporting us in everything we do.